Video games, or well, not even video games, but just any form of media in general. You've most likely, to a degree, interacted with either a fan, an active enjoyer, or an enthusiast of a game, a genre, movie, TV show, whatever the case may be. This, however, is a gacha channel, so let's talk about the communities of gacha games, and I want to talk about what makes them bad and why they are so important. This won't be heavily edited, so if you want to throw this on in the background, go right ahead. But look, there's a lot of different games you can play, there's a lot of different communities you can interact with, and you can either have a really positive experience or a really negative one. I've played BA, I'm getting into Honkai Impact, I played Genshin Impact, I played Arknights. There's Nikke, alongside Destiny 2. We have a wide variety of communities both inside my Discord server and outside of it. And I've tried a bunch of different ones, and I can comfortably say that there are some that are really good and really welcoming, but others that aren't. And I'm talking from the creator's perspective. I don't know what it's like if you're an individual who's maybe trying to find one. But if I'm viewing this from my own analytics and from my own video like to dislike ratio, alongside comments and how people interpret different statements, and direct interactions regarding questions, regarding concerns, complaints, etc., then that changes. Because obviously, if you're going into a game with a lot of questions, you're going to have more than likely a very positive response. People like the idea of getting someone into a video game. People like the idea of getting someone into something they love. If you are a Blue Archive fan, you like the idea of probably getting somebody else to enjoy the game. The same thing with Arknights, because everybody wants somebody to see what they see. If you say this is a great game, you want somebody else to see that this is also a good game. But the problem is, communities aren't just flatlined great, they're not flatline awful either. There are perceptions and experiences that can vary dramatically depending on what you do. And so while I think that if a community knows how to properly welcome a new player, get them into something, get them and give them proper advice for how to progress their account, what to understand, what to do, and can basically simplify a lot of the game's concepts down to very short sentences and bullet points, and that's amazing. It's one of the reasons why I oftentimes recommend larger gacha games, just because if you're talking about the community overall, to new players, it's probably more welcoming and probably a bit better to get into because there's a wealth of knowledge and resources that you can find. From Discord servers that are open to assisting players, to the YouTube side of things, the Twitch side of things, Reddit. There's a bigger variety of knowledge and information that you can find for bigger games. Honkai Impact, Genshin Impact, and Arknights will all have larger communities and larger amounts of resources for newer players to access than something like Blue Archive or Nikke. And all of this sounds really good, but the problem is, it's twofold actually. First off, the larger community gets, larger the negative or more toxic aspect of that community gets. Now, most games, in fact a lot of games, really aren't toxic or bad. You have pretty wonderful communities. But the problem is that people who usually enjoy a game aren't really going to talk as much as people who hate it. And even you'll have people who've never played the game who will hate a game all the same. And what this means is that a community's perception or the outside perception of a video game's community can be altered pretty heavily by how oftentimes they hear or see negative interactions from a specific game's audience. And ultimately, this can be a detriment to the game's overall success. Let's be honest here, how many of you are willing to try a game if you continuously hear negative things either about its community or about the game itself? Regardless as to whether or not those people play the game at all, it still affects the long-term decisions of new potential players. So it's a double-edged sword. The bigger your community, the better your game does, but also the more likely it is to turn away new people. Meanwhile, if we're talking about games in general, one of the things you have to consider is what type of game it is. If a game is very sexual in the way it advertises its characters, then what you're inclined to have is a very horny audience. Let's be honest here, Azure Lane can have wonderful mechanics, but if you're looking at the skins and looking at the character models, there's obviously going to be a disproportionately large amount of audience who are very much into the character designs. On the contrary, if you have a very story-focused game, you're going to get individuals who are interested in the lore, interested in the world building. Or if you have a combat-focused game, you're obviously going to get meta-focused individuals, especially if it's competitive. This means that theoretically, you're going to attract players who want your game's core values, but the broader your audience, the broader your reach, the harder it is to find a concrete amount of people. If your game has exceptional combat that can get really deep, but also very hypersexualized characters, and deep and interesting lore, you have three communities that objectively will not agree on what the game is about and what the best thing about the game is. And this also spreads into content creators. You have different creators who will actively prioritize one aspect or another. I, for instance, love stories in video games. The first videos on this channel were about the story of Blue Archive, and I still think Blue Archive has an amazing story, an amazing characterization. I talk about it all the time. But if we're comparing that to different games I play, you have a variety of options for storytelling and a variety of different games. Let's be honest here, Nikke didn't advertise itself primarily with the story of the game. And so what you're ending up with is a clash of ideals and a clash of viewpoints. I think that a game's community is just as important as the game's quality, but the problem is then that community becomes so fragmented, individuals aren't capable of discerning what they want and who to go to. If I like story and a game has 3 really really good portions, gameplay, story, and design, there's a big chance that what I'm going to meet with is a player who maybe isn't interested in the story at all, and there's a bit of a disconnect between what we interact and what we talk about. The same goes in reverse. If they're interested in gameplay and I like story and don't care about the gameplay or the meta, then it's kind of a disconnect. And it can deter individuals from interacting with bigger sides of the community just because they feel like they won't really vibe with the rest of the audience. Or it can deter you away because if you see that a game like Nikke advertises itself based around the models of the characters, but also has a really good story, then you may be less inclined to talk about the story because you know a vast majority of people will not care. I think that it's incredibly difficult and impossible really to curate your audience to actively enjoy one aspect of a game, but it's also even more difficult to find out what your audience wants, because ideally every developer will put wonderful and extremely high amounts of effort into designs, into the gameplay, into the story. But if your community only likes one of those aspects, then by arbitrarily bringing down the focus on the other points, like hypothetically, if your community is really interested in the story, you can afford to take away resources from focusing on gameplay and design. But in doing so, you instead lose potential audience members. You lose potential players. And so you have these weird systems and weird instances in which consistency will drop, where instead you find a character who's like, oh yeah, the design is amazing, but the story is just meh. And this applies to all different gacha games. Consistent or otherwise, you'll have different systems that really fall flat in comparison to the others. And community sometimes will notice this, but sometimes they won't. You have white knights who defend a game vehemently in the company of the game no matter what. You have individuals who hate the game despite not playing it. You have individuals who hate it just for the fact that it's a gacha game or the fact that it exists or is successful. You have people who arbitrarily decide whether or not they like your opinion and dislike it. If you say, oh, this story is great, they're like, you know what? It's pretty awful, without hearing the rest of your opinion. And you have the reverse as well. And I think that one of the core things to remember, that if you enjoy a game, or if you hate a game, let's say you're an avid enjoyer of Epic 7. I actually had to take a minute to think there. But since I haven't covered Epic 7, I can talk about this. Let's say you're an avid enjoyer of Epic 7. I had a couple coworkers who really loved the game. They actually got me into it. And one of the things I think it's important to remember is that if you dislike a game, if you hate a game, if you don't like certain aspects of it, or you don't like the combat, or whatever the case may be, maybe the gacha system is awful. It's more valuable to hold your complaints until later on when another player or when that person who's just starting is slowly beginning to complain about things when they're deeper into the game. I've had instances where I want to try a game and do try and do love it, but it's very disheartening to hear individuals complain and complain. And this is ironic coming from me, a guy who complains. But what I mean is, if you're introducing someone to a game, it's more important to withhold your complaints until later, because that's going to carry them through. If you complain and give all your negative thoughts for like 5 to 30 minutes up front, then they're probably going to have that in the back of their head while they play. Or they're going to be less inclined to play because then they're going to think, okay, well, what's the point? If you hate the game and you play it constantly, why would I play it? And so I just want to mention that because I think it's really, really important to get that down and to understand it properly. Communities are just as important as the game itself, but arguably a community has a bigger impact than the quality of the game overall. If a game is good, a community will follow. But if a community is awful, it will drag the game down. By the way, that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed, leave a like down below. Happy Thanksgiving if you celebrate that, by the way. I'm sorry I didn't make this in another video and say that then. But either way, if you enjoyed, leave a like, consider subscribing, head over to the Discord server, will be linked down below in the description, and goodbye.